Davey Blackburn, thank you so much for being on the Humble and Honest podcast today.
Yeah, man. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you. I think there's a lot of people, you just share with me some stuff that's going on in your world, and that we're going to be talking a bit about pain. It feels weird to talk about being excited to talk about pain. I'm not necessarily excited to talk about that part, but am excited to fill some people with hope and encouragement, even in the midst of the difficult things they're going through. So thanks for allowing me to have a space.
Absolutely. And, to give context to the listeners, I recently had to pastor through some people that I love, people that I consider incredible members of my church, who have dealt with the loss of their son-in-law and then their son less than a month apart earlier this year. One to a car accident, one who simply went to sleep and just didn't wake up. And the tragedy of these young men, both in their young 20s, that have passed. And then I personally am dealing with the loss of one of my favorite uncles, who essentially just one night on his way home, from what we can tell, had a brain aneurysm. And the sense of just loss, not just in that life, but just trying to make sense of what happened. How could this happen? Why did it happen to them? Is something that I'm really, despite the subject matter, I am eager to talk about with you. But I also know that there are people that currently are listening right now who do not know who you are or your story and what you do. So I would like to start the conversation this way. Who is Davey Blackburn, and how did he get to the platform that he's on today?
It's a really good question. Who is Davey? Well, I would say, I guess I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a husband. I'm a father. Everything else just kind of cascades from there. I have, my life has been marred by pain, just like I feel like everybody who's listening to this on some level, if you weren't born yesterday, your life has been marred by pain and also beauty and redemption. And so, where I guess my story begins, or why there's a microphone in front of my face now in a lot of ways, is I was a pastor and church planter back in 2015 in Indianapolis, Indiana. And in the fall of 2015, we had planted our church in 2012, but the fall of 2015, I left for the gym one morning. There were 3 men who were going on a random crime spree through our city. They broke into the house 3 doors down from me and watched me leave for the gym, and then broke into my home. And my wife and our 15-month-old were there, and my wife was pregnant with our second. She was 13 weeks along, and she was caught up in that home invasion and was shot 3 times and ended up dying in the hospital 24 hours within the next 24 hours due to those injuries. So in one moment, one day, my life was completely upended. And, I found myself having just lost my best friend, my soulmate, my ministry partner, and trying to figure out how to be a single dad and help my son through it while I was reeling with grief, and then how to help my congregation through it while they were also majorly affected by the loss of Amanda. Through that, and we can talk about any of that journey that you want to, but through that, fast forward almost 8 years now. I guess it has been 8 years. Man, what year is it? 20. Yeah. So it will almost be in November of this year, it'll be 8 years. But I now lead a ministry called Nothing is Wasted Ministries. It started with a podcast, just doing this kind of a thing where we're talking to people about their difficult stories. And it has evolved since then to a full-fledged ministry where we help people in trauma, tragedy, major life transition. We help them we say we help you partner with God to take back your story, no matter what you've gone through. And so, you said it just a second ago that you're trying to make sense of some of these things. And the reality is there are a lot of things that happen in our life that don't make sense. And at the same time, we can find our answer to them in Jesus, even though we don't have explanation, even though we can't get, even if Jesus were to tell us, hey, here's why this happened, which I don't believe that everything falls into that kind of a linear sequence. This happens because of this and this and this. I believe in providence and I believe in the sovereignty of God, but I believe that most of pain is a part of this world because we live in a fallen and broken world. We talk about nothing is wasted. There are 4 perpetrators of pain. One is our own sinful choices. Nobody's lied to me, duped me, deceived me more than me. So I live in the fallout of some of the consequences of my own sinful choices, which causes pain. There's other people's sinful choices where they've perpetrated against you. And so, their selfish choices has encroached upon my life. That's part of my story for sure. There's the fact that we live in a fallen and broken world. So at the beginning of time, Adam and Eve swapped the truth of God's word for a lie. And in that moment, sin fractured everything. And we live in this ever increasing unraveling of the universe, which is why there's disease and famine and really death. And, and then there's spiritual attack. And those are really what I call the 4 perpetrators of pain, none of which are like God, right? So God, we tend to blame God or ask God for some kind of reason why he let this happen to us. And I think a lot of times that's misplaced and misappropriated.
Interesting.
And so there's some things in our life that happen that have no reason. But I always say that even if something is as senseless as what is, as you're trying to wrestle through some of your own grief, is what happened to my wife, that there can be meaning and purpose that come from it. And we know that at some point, God's going to make it all right. Like he's going to right every wrong that has happened in our life. He's going to make all sad things become untrue. And, scripture tells us he wipes away every tear from our eye. He will do that one day. So right now we live in this place where we're trying to wrestle with it. And what we need more than explanation, I believe, is we need incarnation. We need God with us. And that if we open up our heart and open up our eyes to see where God is in our story, he will show himself to us in a way that's personalized and custom tailored for us. And we will experience the presence of God, which really supersedes any kind of pain that we're experiencing. It puts this like healing balm on our soul so that we can come to a place of contentment and acceptance, And so that's really what I try to help people with. We have a course called Pain to Purpose. We launch it in churches all over the country. Think of it like the Financial Peace University of Pain and Trauma. It functions very similar to that. Small groups or a class setting. And we just try to help people come to a place of healing in whatever trauma they've experienced so that they can move forward on purpose and on mission, so that they can really step into the jujitsu kind of thing that God wants to do in their story to turn the enemy's work in your life around back on the enemy and see that he wants to use it for good. So,
yeah, you said a lot of powerful things just now, and there's a lot that I want to unpack from it. But the one thing, that I do really want to hit on is something that you said, your story, where God fits in your story. And I do think that so often, especially in the midst of trauma, whether it's the situations that we just mentioned or something else that is more resonant with someone listening right now, is where was God in the midst of this situation? Where was his part in my story? And you've given it some language already, but if you'd be willing, can you give me an idea of how you interpreted where was God in the midst of your story and how you found him and how you even communicated that to your congregation and your family members? Because that's also really important. And I think if we don't do it right, we can actually cause more damage because of how we articulated what God was doing or not doing in our situations.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that for so long, the church or Christians have done damage in the midst of these, dark nights of the soul seasons or grief, because we kind of put a lot of platitudes to the situation. We feel uncomfortable with it. And so we pull out these like pithy theological phrases. We say, well, at least they're in a better place, or and you're like, hold on a second. Like, I don't even know if I like believe half of the things that you're saying. God needed another angel. And so it's like, well, no, that's not even, there's nowhere in scripture that says that. That's just you feeling uncomfortable right now. And you're trying to help me feel comfortable. with what's going on, are hopeful in this. And so I think what we need to do instead is really facilitate environments or facilitate relationships that can welcome God or invite him to show that person where he was in the midst of all of it, where they can begin to step back and see God in their own story. And so what I try to do anytime I'm coaching somebody, or when I teach, when it comes to Nothing is Wasted Ministries, is I teach like, how do we gain some distance from our story to step back and look at our story and say, okay, God, where are you in this? And he will often show us what I call his thumbprints, indicators throughout our story that he's in the story, and that this hasn't caught him by surprise. That, all right, here's a pithy phrase for you, that what's over our head is still under his feet, right? But that's true. And that's anchored, to go, okay, even if I don't understand it, God, I know you're in it. So you're working and you're doing something in this. And so for me, everyone it's custom tailored for everyone. So now when I coach people, I say, hey, I want you to go and ask God where he was. And I want you to ask God to reveal that to you. And I'm telling you, I have seen so many times, time and time again, I'm like, this is amazing, Lord, how you keep showing up. Either someone's got a dream or they've got some kind of an aha moment or revelation or something that God goes, this is where I was. And it really brings this healing to this person. And so for me, where that happened is several, I could write an entire volumes of a book of where God showed up, but there's some really big key moments. First of all, when we were in the hospital waiting on test results to come back, I was sitting on the opposite side of the hospital bed with Amanda's sister. The doctors had told us, hey, there was swelling in her brain. And if we were going to, if they were going to be able to, they would try to operate, but they were doing some brain scans to see if, there was any activity. And so while we're kind of sitting there waiting for these test results to come back, well, while we're waiting, I knew that if Amanda could hear anything, she wasn't conscious, but if she could hear anything, she'd want to listen to elevation worship. That's what she used to run to. It just really brought a lot of, peace to her soul. And so I put on Pandora radio station elevation worship. Well, Pandora is randomized. You don't get to choose what song comes up first or what kind of, and so put it at the foot of her bed. The first song that came up is the song Nothing is Wasted. Now that was not in our colloquial, other than I had heard that song before, but it was like a moment where God reached into this absolute, the darkest moment that I could have ever thought to be in my life. Could have never imagined that I would be sitting there in the hospital. 15 months earlier, I was sitting on the same side of a hospital bed. Her sister sitting on the same side she was sitting in that moment right there, 15 months earlier when Amanda was bringing Weston into the world. So never in my mind am I fathoming here 15 months later, I would be sitting here and we're about to lose her. But this song comes on and it's like God reaches in and he's like, hey, listen, this is what I felt and sensed right there is this is not going to turn out the way that you want it to, but I promise you, I'm not going to waste this. And that became this anchor for me that in the midst of the darkest thing that I could imagine going through, God was there. And it's like Psalm 23:4 came to life. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And there was something about that created a calm in the middle of the storm, like a peace that passed all understanding. And that became a mantra for our family. It became something that we held on to. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted. God's not going to waste this. Well, then it reminded me of what Amanda did. She was doing it as a hobby. She had turned it into a little business. Every time I tried to get her to scale the business, she was like, stop, it's not fun anymore. Like, I just want to do this as like a little business hobby. But she would take furniture off the side of the road that somebody had thrown out, or she'd buy it on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something, right? Garage sailing. And she would restore that piece of furniture and she would sell it for this incredible profit. First time she ever tried to do this, she called me up. She goes, hey, pick this dresser up off the side of the road. And I'm like, what in the world are you going to do with this? This thing is garbage. It is trash. Like somebody threw this out. And she looked at me and she said, Davey, just give me a little time and trust me. And I'm going to turn this into something beautiful. And man, she did. And then she sold it for this like astronomical profit. And I'm like, what, how did you do that? So So then my gears are turning, you know, I'm like, okay, let's figure out how we can make this. And she's like, stop. She loved the art of it because she believed nothing was wasted, that she could take what the world turned their back on or threw out or discarded and said, this is unusable. This is trash. And she could turn it into something that was beautiful. And that's what I felt like the Lord whispered to me that week, right after she passed away. It was, Davey, trust me, give me a little time. I'm going to turn this into something beautiful. And so those are moments that God's showing up. Well, then, you know, I look back and I started tracking something. It was November 11th, 2011, that we packed a moving van up from South Carolina to move to Indianapolis to plant a church. It was November 11th, 2015. So 4 years to the day that she passed away. And that's not the way that we didn't pack up this moving van, go to plant this church and think like, this is what's going to happen in 4 years. There was no semblance of an idea. In fact, we had this expectation of God that we were going to, it was going to be difficult, but we were going to see all these lives change and this church grow. And, you know, and I had this agreement with God that you're going to protect my family. Like, this is how, you know, that's just kind of this unwritten rule that you have. Like, we're going to go through hard, but like my family's going to be good.
Yeah.
And so it dislodged this thing that I was holding God to, that I believed about him. This this arrangement that I had constructed with God, and I was holding him to something that he isn't, right? He never promised that she would never leave me or abandon me or not be there for me, or that she would never, he promised he would never, right? So it caused me to have to reconstruct a lot of things, but in seeing those thumbprints of him in our story, that 4 years to the day, right? Nothing is wasted. All these kinds of things, it showed me this one thing that was so imperative. I think it's imperative in the midst of our grief journeys, that he has always been in our stories.
Yeah.
He has always been faithful to see us through these things, and he always will be. And so when we experience that kind of intimacy with God in the deep, dark night of the soul, we know that now that any future storm that I go through, any tragedy that hits my life, I know God has shown up for me. And I know he has personally spoken to me in those moments and healed me in those moments. And then he's restored me in those moments. And then he has done something to turn this around for good. And so I think that's where I would help people to say, okay, here's how God is showing up in your story. Track that, map that, look for those thumbprints. And then what you're going to do is it's going to allow you to step back and gain some distance. You're not going to be embedded in your story so much that you're caught up in the minutia and the emotional, and now you're able to look back and you're able to see not just your own story, but you're able to see the story arc of God, which is a story arc of redemption in your story. And it gives you hope. This is why scripture tells us that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope.
Yeah.
It's really only through suffering, as we walk through it hand in hand with the Lord, that we're able to be imbued with this thing called hope. That's really what our soul desires, is hope, peace. It doesn't desire us to live this like happy, charmed life. We think it does, but that's not what our soul desires.
Yeah. That's so true. And man, thank you so much for your vulnerability, even sharing those key details. And something that is very clear is that you have such a mature faith in God that it kept you stable. Obviously there were hard times and there were difficult conversations you had in prayer, no question, but God seemed to have been an anchor nonetheless.
Yeah.
You were able to walk through suffering. How do you approach the person that's stuck in suffering? Where whatever it is, and to be clear, again, we're talking about things that might be, not might be, but we're talking about things that would be put in the category of tragedies.
Right.
But we also know that there are people that are dealing with very real pain that's not necessarily on that same scale, but at the same time is keeping them in a place of pain that they don't really know how to walk through.
That's right.
How do you address that person? And in the sense of like, hey, I know you're hurting, but there's more. I promise you there's more. Is that what you say? Is there a process to saying it that makes them more receptive to it? Talk to me through that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of layers within that. I think, first of all, you're right. We're talking about what we call big T tragedy, like this upending moment in your life, or a big loss, or a big, and that can be a loss of anything. I think we have to recognize that loss of a spouse, or loss of a child, or loss of a parent, that is one type of loss. But you also have loss of dreams, loss of a sense of feeling of safety, loss of that can be enacted, catalyzed, if you will, through other types of events. You could have a job loss. You could have the loss of a marriage and the dreams through divorce. You could have, and so recognizing that, first of all, it is an exercise of futility to try to compare pain. We can't look at someone else's story and go, well, I haven't gone through what they've gone through, so that must not apply to me, right? Like, pain is pain. Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, he talked about, this is a guy who survived the Holocaust. He was in concentration camps, in Auschwitz, and a couple other camps. And he writes about in Man's Search for Meaning about that idea of comparing loss or comparing suffering. He says that he observed the gas chambers, and he said, pain is a lot like when gas fills up a chamber. It doesn't matter the size of that chamber. Gas fills it to the fullest capacity. And that's the same thing when it comes to pain. So my pain's different than your pain, which is different than someone else who's listening to this. But many of the principles are true. One, pain hits all of us. Yeah. That is a common denominator of life. That's the equalizer. That's the great equalizer, that we are all living in this human experience where we're going to experience pain. We don't have to be afraid of that, right? We don't have to, like, some people are just kind of sitting on edge waiting for the next shoe to drop. We don't, because we know that ultimately we serve the God who is the answer to pain. And he wrapped himself in flesh and came and subjected himself to the human experience and walked through suffering, not to just give us an example, but to walk with us in it. Right. And to ultimately be the answer to it, so that he could destroy the curse of pain, the curse of sin in our lives, so that one day we could have this hope. So we don't have to be afraid of it, but what we do have to do is we have to recognize what kind of pain we're experiencing, so that we can properly determine, okay, what's the path for this pain? So there's the big T tragedy. There's the little T trauma, which is like 1,000 paper cuts, that often is some of the most dangerous types of pain, because it goes unaddressed. Usually you kind of shove it under the rug and go, well, that's not that big of a deal because it was just one little cut. Well, 1,000 cuts over and over and over and over that go unaddressed can lead to infection, if I'm going to continue the metaphor, and can lead to sepsis and can kill you just as fast as a leg that's amputated that's not addressed.
Yeah.
So you have to address, okay, is this big T tragedy, or is this little T trauma that has compounded over the years? They're all going to have some kinds of really fresh wound triggers that emerge. And what I encourage people to do, in fact, it's imperative, and we talk about this in the Pain to Purpose course, is that those triggers are usually something that we end up villainizing, because they're negative emotion. They're like, we don't like that. That hurts. That's painful. I want to just shut that out and suppress it. Or numb to it. I develop coping mechanisms around those triggers, or I avoid those things. But those triggers, if we can see them differently, it'll lead us to healing. What triggers are invitations from God into deeper healing.
Interesting.
And they're indicators from God that there is deeper healing that needs to happen. So, it's one of the reasons why early on, right after I lost Amanda, it was very difficult for me to talk about the details of that day. I would have visceral, like, somatic experience that my body would shake. I would, because it was so traumatic to walk in and find her. But now I can talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
because now that there's not that spiritual stronghold in my life anymore, because I didn't run away from the trigger. The trigger was, okay, if I'm talking about this, that hurts, that I don't like what that's doing to my body, so I'm just not going to talk about it, right? Or I'll give you another example. There was a song that right after Amanda passed away, when I would get in my car, my Bluetooth would connect to my phone automatically, and the first song on the playlist was a song that was played at our wedding. And so for the first several weeks, I would get so mad about that song coming up. Like it was such a reminder of what I had and now don't have. And I'd I'd slam the dashboard, turn the song off. And then I had, many of your listeners are going to be familiar with Pastor Levi Lesko. I had him reach out to me. He reached out a month after Amanda passed away with a text message, and he walked me through that concept of running toward the roar, which he writes about in his book, Through the Eyes of a Lion.
Yeah.
And the whole concept is running toward those triggers, running toward the things and so he encouraged me to do that. So I knew I had to go in my car, I had to listen to this song on repeat until I just let whatever needed to happen. And so I get in this car and I just I'm weeping. I mean, it's just like ugly cry, like the worst ugly cry you've ever seen for about 45 minutes as this song's on repeat. Mm-hmm. But then I'll never forget what happened next. The only way I can describe it is waves of grief came over me, and then immediately following waves of grace. It's like God met me in that moment. And my body had been like all knotted up. Like I was actually getting physically sick because I was holding on to or trying to contain all that grief. And it was actually leaving me stuck. So you asked earlier, like, okay, well, if someone feels stuck, well, a lot of times people get stuck in grief because they're not actually leaning into their grief. They're trying to avoid it because it's too painful. And so what needs to happen is counterintuitive. In order to not get stuck, you got to lean into it, which is why Paul says, I want to share in his resurrection, but first I have to share in his suffering, right? There is a pathway through the valley, not out of it. You can't like avoid it. Like we got to go through the valley because we've got to experience the fullness of healing that God wants us to experience. And so as we begin what happened to me that day is I would just letting out this massive ugly cry is then God shows up. He all of that knotted upness just began to unravel. And it was like, I felt released now I wasn't healed in that moment, but I was one step closer toward healing. And then I felt empowered. I felt like, wait a minute, because what grief can tend to do, tragedy, trauma, all of those things, whether it's big T or little t, it can cause you to feel out of control. Like you've lost your sense of agency. That's actually part of the definition of PTSD is now you are having a reaction over something that, it happened in your past. And now you're not in that situation anymore, but your body still thinks it is. It feels out of control, fight, flight, or freeze. That whole mechanism happens. And so what happened with me that day is I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not, like, I actually have some agency in this now. Now I can run toward those tricks. I can lean into my pain. So I began to write down all the things that were triggering me and make an appointment with those things. And that, I believe wholeheartedly, was the thing that began to accelerate healing in my life. Because what the enemy wants to do is the enemy wants to keep you held captive and bound in those things.
Yeah.
So he wants those things to look so dominant in your life and so foreboding that you don't want to approach them at all, because that's what's going to get you paralyzed and get you stuck. And what God is inviting us into is like, okay, this is going to be very, very painful to lean into, but I've got healing for you through this. Oh, and also we're going to untangle some other things inside that you never knew that we were going to touch, but we're going to look at those things too that you need healing and freedom from as well while we're in the process. It's like a surgeon who cuts you open and it's like, oh, I found this in there too. I'm going to go ahead and take that out. That's not supposed to be in there. While we're in here, let's go ahead and take that out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then that's why you come through these things as you lean into your pain. You come through a actual stronger version of yourself, a more mature version of yourself. Because you're not just healing from that incident. God uses that to heal you from all these other things as well.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Something that you said that I think is important as well is that you can experience a breakthrough in an area, but that does not mean you've completed the process as
Oh,
well.
that's right.
And
That's right. That's really well put.
yeah, and I
Really well put.
think that too oftentimes we can have a moment of, I feel better, I
Mm.
feel like I'm going to make it, I feel strong, only for there to be something else in a different area that causes for us to, respond in a way that we know is unhealthy or
Yeah.
unhelpful. Um,
Yeah.
and it's because like you haven't completed that process. I don't know. Is there a sense of completion, or is it just daily? Just I'm
No,
better
it's
than
a
I
great
was
question.
before. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a sense of completion in the sense that you maybe close certain chapters out, but you're still in the same book. I think there's always, I mean, I experience quote unquote triggers or reminders or those like gut grief moments still where I'm like, kind of takes your breath away.
Mhm.
The difference is now I'm not afraid of those. Now I have the tools. Now I know what to do with them. Now I'm like, oh yeah, okay, this is normal. This is, and
Mhm.
I can hold it. I can honor it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I can hold space with it. I'm not trying to run away from it anymore. And I think it's one of those things where grief becomes this thing where it's like you always carry it with you, but you carry it much differently, almost like if I'm going to give you a 50-pound weight to carry around with you everywhere you go, at first you're going to struggle with it, but eventually you're going to start to form muscles and methods around. You're like, okay, I can carry this
Yeah.
because I know how to carry this now. I'm stronger.
Mhm.
And then the beautiful thing about that and where that metaphor breaks down is like, there's so much of that pain that we don't have to carry because we can lay it at the feet of Jesus.
Mhm.
He's like, I'll carry this for you.
That's so good. I want to transition in a moment, but there's something else that you said that I want to ask a question about, because again, you're leading in the midst of all of this.
Mm.
You still have a child, you still have a congregation. And I think we have experienced this with several pastors and leaders. And I know it's not pastors and leaders that are all listening, but I feel like you've seen a sense of, especially after everything that happened in the pandemic, a level of
Mm.
fatigue and pain that they have
No
not
doubt.
actually processed well.
Yeah.
And I want to ask specifically, how do you, in an area of leadership, help
Mm.
people in the midst of the pain that you're dealing with? Because
Yeah.
if you're a mom, you still have to parent in the midst of the loss. If
That's right.
you're
Yeah.
a pastor, a business owner, whatever, there are things that are happening that you don't necessarily get to have those responsibilities taken away from you because of the
Yeah.
tragedy that you or the trauma that you've dealt with. How do you do that well, where it's
Yeah.
honest and vulnerable but still leading people in a forward direction?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to completely deconstruct the idea that we have to have it all together in order to lead people.
That's good.
Right. And some of the best, most honest leadership moments that we have are ones where we go, I don't know what to do, but let's put our eyes on the Lord right here. Right. 2 Chronicles 20. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. We're just leading people to the throne room. We're just leading people to the feet of Jesus. We're leading people to put their eyes on Jesus. And sometimes they need this more as in parenting and leadership, more as caught than taught.
Hmm.
So we can tell people, hey, put your eyes on Jesus, but until they see you as a leader setting an example, actually in those moments, putting your eyes on Jesus, they're never going to really understand what that means.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just leading them to put their eyes on us, where we're like coming in with the S and the cape and like, I got this, And I think that's where a lot of leaders want to be. They want to feel like they've got the acumen and the competence to be able to lead people. Cause I've been there, I've climbed the mountain. And sometimes, a lot of times in life, we have to lead people up a mountain that we've never climbed before, but we're trying to figure that out as well.
Hmm.
And that's where we've just got to put our eyes on Jesus. So I think we have to recognize, I think we have to become very self-aware
Yeah.
in those moments. I think we have to become okay with the fact that our capacity may not be where it was at one point when we are quote unquote healthy, or we hadn't experienced that. We have to okay, you know what? My decision making is going to be a lower capacity. I found it in myself. I'm like, man, things I used to just like, yeah, I can make a decision just like that. It would bog me down because my emotional capacity, my tank was full right now of grief, of trying to sort through it. And so I didn't have the capacity to make some of these emotional leadership decisions. So I just had to be honest with my team about that, and honest with the people that we were leading. Like, hey, here's where I'm at right now. And that actually, it was interesting because it gave everybody permission to be honest as well.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we're leading the way in vulnerability too. We have to lead the way in honesty and lead the way in humility. I love the name of your podcast. Like, let's just get real about this. For far too long, pastors have tried to put on some kind of a facade or pretense that we've got it all together. And that's why you're seeing it's a house of cards. You're seeing so many of them stumble and fall. And, it's not that we're not going to stumble. Like, we need to be honest, and we need to have a safe space to be able to be honest in front of our people. And at the same time go, hey, he's the answer, and that let's all look to him. And so, I would say, to really truly answer your question, be very self-aware, be aware of where you're going to like your capacity is not going to be what it was. And then continue to just point people in the direction of finding their fulfillment, finding their satisfaction, finding their healing, finding their hope in Jesus. And I don't think you can go wrong in that.
That's encouraging to hear and understand, because even as I was preaching from stage several months ago about this whole situation, I legit broke down crying as I'm talking about this, and just how impactful it was even at the funeral of this couple. Try not to get too emotional even thinking about it now.
Yeah.
I spoke of how, as they were mourning the loss of these two young men, they were worshiping in the front row. And what a sight to see how they still believed God was good in the midst of all of that, and how that spoke to me, where I, as the pastor, I, as the person that was even going to share a message about how God is in control and he's still good, was wrestling with, like, I actually struggle to comprehend how they can worship so boldly in the midst of this, and it's not to say my faith was in a sense of, it's not to say I was struggling with my faith in that sense, but I had to own up to the fact that it's like, I think I'm angry at God more than I'm actually being honest about. And how do I communicate that as a pastor, as a leader who's literally about to go up there, and my whole job is to encourage people? It's a difficult thing. And me and God, we had our conversations, and we're still on that process, and I'm in a much better place. Praise God for it. But it was a truly vulnerable moment. And having that sense of permission of, like, it's okay to be in that space, even as a leader, is encouraging to hear.
It's a trap from the enemy, man. He wants to try to get us to keep things in the dark. And I always encourage people, like, people will say sometimes, don't question God, because that shows a lack of faith. Actually I think it shows a lack of faith when you don't question God.
Yeah.
Because you have questions. When these kinds of upending things happen in your life, when you experience pain of any nature, of any sort, it does not reconcile with the God that we have been taught in our Western American culture. Because unfortunately, we do not have a good theology of suffering, because we're blessed in America, right? I mean, we're living a first world country. We have so much available to us. And so we have trouble when what happened, Jesus said, in this world, you will have sorrow, but take heart, I've overcome the world. But we're surprised when sorrow comes into our life. And then we're like, how could you, God? This doesn't line up with what people taught me, that you were supposed to be some kind of vending machine. As long as I followed after you, then, like, everything's going to be up and to the right in my life. And it's like, God's like, I need to deconstruct that because that's not. And so people will say, well, you shouldn't question God. No, I think you need to take your questions to God.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is you take your questions that you inevitably have about God, about this world, about yourself, and you put it in your back pocket and you walk away from God.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what has happened in this, like, I'm on like a soapbox about this, but this deconstruction movement, it's a whole group of people who have walked through pain, walked through trauma, walked through this unearthing kind of thing in their life, and they're mad at God. And so they're like, I'm just going to walk away from it, rather than going, hey, God, I got some real raw questions here, and I need you to help me sort through these things, rather than engaging with like Jacob wrestling with God is what script, like God, he left that in scripture, not just left it in scripture. It seems to God that it was so important to highlight this wrestling thing right here that he ended up naming Jacob Israel, which became the moniker to mark his people.
Yeah.
He's like, that's what my people need to be about, is wrestling with me. This is what's going to mark my people, is they're going to be wrestling with me, because it's only in the wrestling that we experience the presence of God, the peace of God, and then ultimately we're able to understand the mysteries of God. Mm. And so that's where, I'm so glad that you were able to be honest with your congregation and say, hey, here's where I'm at. And I'm going to be honest. Like, I always joke around when I'm on stage and I'm speaking. I'm like, hey, I'm asking you to be honest right now. I know you're not used to being honest in church. And you always get this laughter because people know it's true. They're coming in thinking that they've got to have put on the facade, the Halloween costume, that everything's fine. And it's just not. And so if we're able to go, hey, I'm mad at God right now, it's so refreshing. People are like, oh my gosh, thank you. I can take off this mask and we can actually get real about it. And now that's the space where we can really meet with God.
That's so good. And I even connect with what you're saying, because there's a level of, and you brought this up earlier, right? Where it's just like people give you these bumper sticker cliche answers to suffering. And even if it's part true, it's actually unhelpful. That's not actually helping me right now. And then, and again, this is just me being humble and honest, experiencing the funeral for my uncle, which was several weeks ago at the time of this recording. There was people literally like talking about cheer up and God's plan and all that other type of stuff. And I was like, it's like, that feels so like unhelpful. And in this perspective, you threw that out there. I don't think you actually wrestled with God and came up with that truth. You just said what you thought needed to be said in a setting like this. And I think that's where there's often hurt and dishonesty, because that empty platitude now sometimes can give an impression of God to me that was never true to begin with. But I do want to transition now to your show. That's how I discovered you. It's an incredible show. You've been on now for a little while. What are some of your favorite episodes that you have had the chance to do on your show?
Oh,
goodness. Would love to know that from you.
Okay. Well, man, there's been so many of them. That's a great question. Favorite episodes. The show's called Nothing Is Wasted podcast. We interview people who have gone through just really difficult things, but God's shown up in their story and they're able to give testimony to that. So they share their story. We believe Revelation 12, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And so it's a place where people are able to be honest and real about their pain, but then also those of us who are listening to it, we can borrow faith from people. And that's the way it started. I was going on this journey of healing and I was meeting these people who were giving me a lot of encouragement. And I'm like, I want the world to hear that. Like, I just derive so much encouragement and hope. I borrowed your faith for a season when I didn't have my own. And so that's why the Nothing Is Wasted podcast started back in 2017. I've got so many favorite ones. I think some of them were like bucket list ones, to be honest with you. And that's just, personally for me, I recently got to interview Randy Alcorn. That was a bucket list one for me because his book Heaven was so instrumental in my grieving process. I recently got to let's see here.
You have a lot of great ones, by the way.
There are so many good ones, man.
I've actually not heard a bad one
every
yet
single.
from you.
What's funny is every single time I always say, I'm like, oh my gosh, this might be my favorite one. And it's like literally every single time because they're just so rich. And that's what's beautiful about them, man, is like, and that's what's beautiful about just sharing our story is even if we didn't go through the same thing that that particular person went through, we can still derive so much encouragement because of the pervasive principles of walking through pain and suffering, you know? It's just you know, so we have people that say that all the time. They're like, I don't know. I haven't gone through what that person just went through, but my story is different, but this has just been so encouraging to me. Goodness. I'm over here looking at the list of them right now and I'm just like, geez, I don't know if I can pull out a lot of favorites because they all are just so good. Oz Hillman was another one that to me was like a bucket list one just because, I read a lot of his writings as well.
Say their name again. Who?
Oz Hillman is his name. Okay. Yeah, that was a favorite one of mine. Geez. It's a good question. I think people are just going to have to dive into it. And, you know, we start all the way back. The very first episode is me. It's a 2-part episode, me talking with my late wife's dad. And that's where we all started. It's just like, hey, let's wrestle through this together. And so it's interesting. Other people have said that they can see a little bit of the arc of our healing as I'm talking to different individuals, they can see, you know, even my healing continue on the journey and stuff. So another one, Johnny Erickson Tata was like a major bucket list for me. I read a book from of hers when I was young. You know, you said it earlier that I had a pretty deep faith before this tragedy hit my life, but I test that to the fact that I had a really rich heritage, that my family is just an incredible family. You know, I'm a pastor's kid, but I'm not like the rebellious pastor's kid. Like my dad, he was the same person on stage as he was at home, just like an incredible man. He still is, still alive. And my mom, the same. So they have an authentic faith. Their whole family have an authentic faith. We'd sit around Thanksgiving and Christmas, you know, around with family. And every year we'd talk about how God had shown up for each of our families that year. And I would just observe my aunts and uncles sharing, okay, here's where we were in a situation and God showed up this year, and it just tears. Everybody's just crying through the whole thing, you know? And so that marked me early on to see people testify to, here's how God shows up in our difficult situations. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I remember reading a book by Johnny Erickson Tata during some point in my upbringing, and the fact that I got to have a phone conversation with her on our podcast, I was fangirling. I'm sitting there, my wife right now, Christy, and it was on the phone. We couldn't do video because she wasn't able to do video. So I'm on the phone and I'm like, I can't believe I'm looking at, I'm like, I couldn't even ask questions because I was just so enamored with the richness that was coming from her. And that's what I think has marked me through this whole process, is that we all marvel at the depth and the richness that comes from someone who's gone through extreme suffering, but none of us want to have to go through what they went through to have the maturity they have. And Elizabeth Elliot calls that the gain of loss. She says, what you gain in relationship to the giver far outweighs the loss of the gift. And that's what I would encourage your listeners with, is that you're going to experience loss throughout this life, unfathomable loss for some of us. And yet the giver is just so much more unimaginably greater than any loss that we could experience in this life. And that was true of my late wife. I mean, Jesus was her first love. Undoubtedly. I mean, she was so passionately, madly in love with Jesus. And so now, even when I still grieve her and wish she was here, I'm reminded, like, man, she's with Jesus. And I don't say that as some kind of trite platitude. It's like, she's with her first love, and I just can't wait to see her one day. And when I do, I'm going to get to see her and Jesus on the same day. And I hope this is what drives me in life. My prayer is that Jesus looks at me and goes, well done, good and faithful servant. And then I look at Amanda and she says, I'm proud of you. And man, that gets me up every single morning. Incredible. Every single morning to go, okay, how can we bring meaning to this awful, horrible thing that has happened to us because our eyes are on eternity?
Davey, you clearly have given us a perspective today of what happens when you take whatever pain that we have and you give it to God and you see what God can do in and through it. I'm so grateful for this time with you. We are running out of time though. Real quick, you mentioned a lot of incredible resources and ways to get to know you and your ministry. How can we best get connected with all of that real quick?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for asking. Nothingiswasted.com is the site for our ministry. You could connect with me on Instagram, Davey Blackburn, DaveeyBlackburn. At Nothing is Wasted Ministries is our Instagram handle. And then if anybody wants to just kind of get started on the journey, we have a 7-day devotional that we'd love to send you to your email. Just text NIW to the number 66866. You can text that right now and it'll prompt you to put your email address in, and then it'll just start sending you emails of a 7-day devotional that we have put together for you. So
incredible. Davey Blackburn, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.